Hi, good morning. Uh, Welcome to another class, beta. And today we want to go ahead and we want to take a new topic, right? And I hope all of you have gone ahead and done your homework. I've given you 5 questions yesterday, right? So I hope you have done those questions. Now, for today's class, we want to go ahead and we want to begin with a new topic, and that is called as relation between central bank and treasury. Relationship between central bank and treasury. Now, but if you go ahead and if you try to Google this thing, agar aap is pe, if you try and you look out for some articles on this, there are some very, very famous articles, right? And not only there are articles, but you will also see that it is the IMF, right? If you just just take a minute, just look through Google, you will notice that IMF has also published various articles talking about the relationship between the treasury and the central bank, right? About how the two are very closely knitted, right? About why the relationship between the two is of utmost importance, right? So, although we go ahead and we say that the central bank is an autonomous body, right? We go ahead and we say that the central bank is supposed to act on its own, right? It should not be taking its decision on the basis of the of the government, what the government wants. I mean, the central bank should not be going ahead and doing something just because the government is dictating it to do, right? Still, these two are very closely related to each other, right? So it is the central bank, right, which is going to go ahead and help the government when it needs money, right? When it needs funds, right? It is the central bank which is going to go ahead and help the government when, there has to be some kind of fiscal monetary coordination, fiscal policy and monetary policy coordination. And suppose the government thinks that the economy is in recession, right? But it cannot somehow use its fiscal policies. Again, it's the central bank, right, which is going to go ahead and help the government bring the economy out of recession, out of depression, right? How? By introducing certain monetary policies, right? So, although we say, and we have always studied this in detail, that the central bank is on its own, right? The central bank must work on its own. Still, we need to understand that the two are very closely knitted, right? The two are very closely related to each other, right? And central bank has an important role to play in helping the government, right? So, when we see that there is proper coordination, right? That proper coordination actually helps to maintain peace in the economy, right? We need proper coordination between the central bank and the government, right? For the economy to work in a smoother way, right? So today's lecture is all about that. हम आज के सेशन में यही सब पढ़ेंगे कि उनका फॉर्मल रिलेशनशिप क्या है, हिस्टोरिकली उनका रिलेशनशिप क्या रहा है, ठीक है? देन वी विल गो एंड स्टडी कि कहाँ कहाँ पे कोऑर्डिनेशन पॉसिबल है, कौन कौन से एरियाज हैं जहाँ पे सेंट्रल बैंक और गवर्नमेंट मीट करते हैं, राइट? एंड फाइनली वी विल गो एंड वी विल एंड विद द इंडियन कॉन्टेक्स्ट. हम ये भी बात करेंगे कि इंडिया में इन स्पेसिफिकली क्या इसका रोल है, कैसे ये दोनों सेंट्रल बैंक और गवर्नमेंट एक साथ काम करते हैं, राइट? सो दिस इज द एजेंडा फॉर टुडेज क्लास, right? Okay. So let us go ahead and begin this class, right, by talking about history first, right? History. Right, beta? So please write it with me. The earliest central banks were set up to finance commerce in the era of gold standard, foster growth in the financial system, and as authority of uniform issuance of notes, right? So initially, when we talk about uh, the banks, banks जो सेंट्रल बैंक था, उसका इनिशियल जो एम था वो ये था कि सबसे पहले तो हमें ये करना है कि हमें किसी तरीके से एक यूनिफॉर्म सिस्टम लेके आना है नोट के लिए, हाँ, ताकि एवरीवन फॉलोज द सेम नोट, राइट? We have to go ahead and we have to foster growth, financial, जो financial economy है, we need to grow that. And of course, हम जो initially gold standard चलता था, उसको हमें properly, we need to enable that, right? So this was the role of the central bank, right? And when we talk about the relationship, ठीक है, between central bank and the government and the treasury, it was a very informal relationship. So historically, the relationship between central bank and the treasury was informal, with central bank directly financing government deficit, right? Managing debt issuance, and holding idle government balances. तो अगर गवर्नमेंट के पास कुछ भी एक्स्ट्रा पैसा था, ठीक है, वो एक्स्ट्रा पैसा कौन मैनेज कर रहा था? सेंट्रल बैंक. अगर गवर्नमेंट को लोन चाहिए था तो वो लोन कौन दे रहा था? सेंट्रल बैंक. ठीक है. अगर गवर्नमेंट को कोई भी डेफिसिट फाइनेंस करवाना था अपना, कोई भी उसने लोन दिया होता और उसको पैसा रेज करना था टू फुलफिल दैट लोन, कौन कर रहा था? सेंट्रल बैंक. सो इनिशियली द सेंट्रल बैंक, historically the central bank was holding the monetary policy and debt issuance, right? It was holding the idle government balances, right? जो भी extra पैसा था government का, it was measuring that. But it was the government who was the primary authority. It was the treasury who was the primary authority. So जो भी decision making रहती थी, whatever was the decision making, it was basically done by the treasury, right? The decision making was done by the treasury. Right, beta? So basically, we can go ahead and say that the central banks were often an extension of the treasury. ट्रेजरी का ही एक्सटेंशन थी सेंट्रल बैंक, राइट? जो भी ट्रेजरी बोलती थी सेंट्रल बैंक वही करता था, ठीक है? अच्छा, नाउ वी नो कि सेंट्रल बैंक टेक्स केयर ऑफ द मॉनेटरी पॉलिसीज एंड वी नो दैट ट्रेजरी, द गवर्नमेंट, इट टेक्स केयर ऑफ द फिस्कल पॉलिसीज, राइट? So what we saw that initially monetary policies were subordinated to fiscal policy needs. माने फिस्कल पॉलिसी जहां जहां पे उसको जरूरत थी मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी की, अकॉर्डिंगली मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी वाज इंट्रोड्यूस्ड, नॉट इंडिपेंडेंटली, right? But it was done to subordinate the fiscal needs. Like, for example, during the war periods, to finance the war, we used to print notes. So monetary policy was subordinating to the fiscal policy need, right? So monetary policy was subordinated to the fiscal needs, especially during wars, right? So we can go ahead and say that ये war period में especially central banks का यही role था. Now, when we talk about the post-war period, post-war means when we talk about 1940s to 1970s, that is when we started looking at central bank more than just, you know, helping the government, right? So you can somewhere, beta, somewhere जो अभी तक हमने लिखा है ना history में, somewhere mention that this is the pre-war and war period. So this is called as the classical period, right? And this classical period is up to World War II. The classical period is up to World War II, right? Where we are saying that the central bank was going ahead and helping the government, especially during the war periods, right? Now, once this is done, right? Once this happened, we started seeing that this had a lot of issues, right? There were a lot of problems that started coming, right, between the central bank and the treasury. One major problem was that the central bank, since it was always listening to the treasury and not doing anything itself, there was dominance of the fiscal policy. Okay, fiscal policy dominant thing over the monetary policy, right? So that is one big issue that we started looking, the dominance of the fiscal policies. Another thing which went ahead and which happened is that we started seeing that the government could manipulate the central bank. जैसे जैसे गवर्नमेंट बोलती थी वैसे वैसे सेंट्रल बैंक करता था, right? Which a lot of times led to inflationary pressure. गवर्नमेंट को लगा कि अरे we don't have enough money in hand. It just asked central bank to print notes. When it asked central bank to print notes, more notes means inflationary pressure, right? So we saw that a lot of times it was actually going ahead and it was leading to inflationary pressure also, right? Another issue, huh? Then what we saw also is that there were some, some distorted liquidity signals. मतलब मार्केट में उतना लिक्विडिटी नहीं होगा, but somehow the government, by manipulating the central bank, was able to show कि मार्केट में काफी liquid space है, काफी ज्यादा पैसा है. So there were distortionary liquidity signals that were coming, right? And a lot of times there were also hidden subsidies to commercial bank, right? So a lot of times what would happen is that the government would deposit its money with some of the commercial banks to get higher interest rate also. Right? So overall speaking, that there were a lot of problems which were there during this period, right? So please write down that This arrangement led to several problems and inefficiencies, like fiscal dominance of or fiscal dominance over monetary policy dominance, right? Inflationary pressure, right? Distorted liquidity signals, and hidden subsidies to commercial bank due to unremunerated government deposits, right? Recognizing these problems, the, we can say there was a need for modern institution framework, right? That delineates the role of the Treasury and central bank. So now we need clearer roles of the Treasury and central bank because there were a lot of issues, right? कि क्या ट्रेजरी करेगा और क्या सेंट्रल बैंक करेगा, क्या गवर्नमेंट करेगी और क्या सेंट्रल बैंक करेगा, इसको हमें बहुत क्लियरली डिफाइन करना था. वी वांटेड a clear transparent role of who will do what, right? And that is where we started understanding that we want to go ahead and we want to introduce the autonomy of the central bank. हमें central bank को एक autonomous role देना होगा, ठीक है? That is one thing. अच्छा, एक चीज और देखना है. हाँ बेटा, this is the classical period. That means it is up to World War II. ठीक है? इसमें I've already explained you कि why, I mean, what were the major problems that we were facing. But another thing that started happening as we were in the classical period is that we started looking at the period of recessions and depressions, right? And during those periods of recessions and depressions, we all know from macroeconomics that there was the upcoming of the Keynesian policies. ठीक है, केन्स आना शुरू हो गया और केन्स ने वैसे ही बोला कि देखो, वी नीड रोल ऑफ द गवर्नमेंट. हम मार्केट को अपने आप में तो नहीं छोड़ सकते हैं. वी नीड द रोल ऑफ द गवर्नमेंट. एंड we know that there is going to be unemployment in the economy. We know that there is going to be economic growth, right? तो वो जो Keynesian period था, जो 1940s का एरा था, 1940 से 1970s, उसमें भी हमने नोटिस किया कि केन्स ने भी एक एक पॉइंट रखा कि देखो, अभी तक तो हम ये सोच रहे हैं कि मार्केट शुड बी लेफ्ट टू इट्स ओन, राइट? बट नाउ वी वांट द गवर्नमेंट टू स्टेप इन. तो उन्होंने गवर्नमेंट को थोड़ा और पावर दिया, राइट? सो इवन ड्यूरिंग द Keynesian period, right, even during the post-war period, the government still had a major role. ठीक? So what we can say is that even when we talk about the post-war Keynesian period, That means 1940s to 1970s की अगर हम बात करें, इसमें भी गवर्नमेंट का एक मेजर फिस्कल डोमिनेंस था, राइट? जो हम इसके बारे में बात कर रहे हैं, जो हमने यहाँ ऊपर देखा, दैट still was holding true in this period also, right? So we can say that during this period, once Keynes saw that even so, अभी तक the central bank were under the government, but government का अपने आप में भी बहुत रोल नहीं था in the classical period, right? So in 1940s to 1970s, the role of government started emerging, right? But the role of central bank was still subsidized, right? So central banks were viewed as partners in achieving full employment and economic growth by Keynes. Monetary policy remained closely tied to fiscal objectives, right? Treasury often dominated central bank operations, leading to fiscal dominance, right? So, so both these periods, I mean, you can just simply say कि up to 1970, you can also combine these two periods together, and you can say that up to 1970, जो central bank है, उनका role बहुत ही limited था, right? And we saw that during Great Depression, Keynes also said कि हमें government का role चाहिए, right? So we were not very focused on the role of the central bank, right? Now, after this beta came the period post 1980s, right? So period post 1980s, right? And this is the period of the monetarists, ठीक है? And they realized कि ये जो गवर्नमेंट है, जो बार बार सेंट्रल बैंक को पैसा प्रिंट करने के लिए बोल रही है, the government is asking the central bank to print money again and again and again. What is happening basically through this is inflationary pressure. बहुत ज्यादा inflationary pressure आ रहा है, बहुत ज्यादा prices rise हो रहे हैं, right? That is what we realized, right? And that is when we started saying that no, the central bank finally have to be given independence, right? So during the 1980s period, right, this is the period of the monetarists, right? Recognition of the inflationary risks of fiscal dominance led to the push for central bank independence, right? Central bank in many countries were given formal independence in setting interest rate and targeting inflation, right? The Treasury's role became more focused on fiscal discipline. So I will just tell you, just give me 1 minute. Fiscal discipline. So you know that in India, uh, if you look at the history of India after independence, there was a lack of fiscal discipline, complete lack, right? The fiscal deficit used to be very high numbers, very, very high numbers, right? And that is where, if you remember, if you have studied history, right, we launched the Fiscal Responsibility and Budgetary Management Act, FRBM Act. So we realized that the government was going ahead and spending overly, right? And therefore, we wanted to put we wanted to go ahead and put a discipline over the government to spend, to look at how money is being spent, right? So the treasury's role was now to ensure this fiscal discipline, right? And debt management, whereas central bank aimed at price stability. So the central bank went ahead and, it aimed at inflationary pressures ko reduce karna, ensuring prices stable, ensuring money does not lose its value. That became